let's talk about, is zero COVID Shanghai lockdown an overreach by the CCP or something more? Is there something underlying happening? I mean, the numbers aren't there to demand for an immediate lockdown like this. This is really weird. Okay, off the bat, I thought this was really strange that this was happening, especially when you put Russia, Ukraine together. So this is an article from Emmanuel Pastrick, and I thought it was a really, really great breakdown as to what I have been gathering is actually happening in Shanghai. So I'm not going to read every single thing, but I'm going to start reading this first paragraph here. So you guys can find this at https://double/circlesandsquares.asia/2022-0417. And on April 15th is when this was written. So he says, corporate newspapers and social media have been flooded with horrific images of the Shanghai lockdown for the last week. A massive enterprise that has confined millions of Chinese to their homes for weeks and has resulted in the implementation of severe restrictions on access to basic supplies. Images of citizens yelling from their apartments in frustration or screaming heartfelt protests and moving soliloquies. Videos of drones and robots patrolling the empty streets of Shanghai present us with a terrifying vision of the totalitarian rule by technology that so many have predicted. The underlying message is that China is the source of this nightmare. So the story that has been put out, but it hasn't been denied by the Communist Party, he says, is so extreme as to invite ridicule. A new, quote, zero tolerance policy for COVID-19, which is a bogus, non-existing disease in their opinion, in the first place, was imposed on all Shanghai citizens. First on the east side of the Huangpu River from March 28th, and then for the entire city from April 1st. Supposedly, all citizens will be tested for COVID-19. According to media reports, only 26,087 new cases of COVID-19 have been found. And of those, only 914 were symptomatic. And there were no pictures of bodies on the ground, as was the case in the Wuhan at the end of 2019. That is to say that the justifications for this lockdown are so absurd as to make the entire process partial, perhaps an action intended to show citizens that they must do exactly what they are told to do, no matter how ridiculous or groundless the premises are. So I agree, there hasn't really been bodies shown, there hasn't been, the case numbers aren't there, right? And so he continues to talk about how the Western media is pushing the fact that this is the Chinese Communist Party doing it, and not just the Western media, but also the Republican, the right is pushing that, oh, this is what we're going to turn into if we allow communism to take over. You see it at the defeat mandates protests, you see it everywhere, right? He talks about Jack Posobiec, who posted a tweet blaming communism and saying this is what the CCP is doing to the 26 million people of Shanghai. The Human Rights Watch condemned China for its human rights violations in Shanghai on April 6th, saying that the Chinese government should respect the right to health and other basic rights in its response to COVID-19 surge in the country. But they didn't talk about other policies that have been happening. So the issue he talks about in the next slide on 49 is that while they're blaming communism, right, they're blaming this lockdown on communism, there is no major historical citation to where this can be found in the Chinese communist tradition, meaning before there has never been a shutdown like this in the Chinese communist tradition. And he says, quote, no part of the imposition of techno-fascism can be traced back to the cause of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai for class struggle and for resistance to imperialism. The model for the Shanghai lockdown, it turns out, is the lockdown of Boston after the Boston Marathon bombing on April 15, 2013, exactly 9 years ago. On that occasion, the US federal government, specifically the FBI, used a murky charge of a terrorist attack about which serious doubt remains as an excuse to lock down vast sections of the city of Boston and confine citizens to their homes while armed police patrolled the streets. I vaguely recall that. But, you know, the whole point that they're pointing out is that this is more similar to that lockdown and the way it is organized. And he's questioning, is this being organized by the same people that organized the Boston lockdown and similar lockdowns around the world, and not by the Chinese Communist Party, or just not primarily? Kind of saying that there might be people that have sold out and that are like helping this whole thing. And I'm also going to mention how Shanghai is the perfect area for this, because Shanghai is the most liberal / Western type of city in China, and it is just perfect for the incoming connections to the West and a lot of oligarchs and billionaires. And so he also talks about how there's like all these suicide videos that have been put out in media, but it's hard to assume that they're real or not. It's hard to like define, are these videos real or not? Are they being manufactured? We don't know. He talked about, on slide 51, a popular video featuring a dog-shaped robot that kind of looks like the Boston Dynamics Spot Mini robot, and that it was on the streets going around with a microphone on its back, telling the people of Shanghai to stay inside, and said that anyone who looked at the video with critical eyes had to be doubtful. The speaker was carelessly strapped to the back of the robot with barricade tape in what appears to be a careless stunt, and it was most certainly not representative of government policy. He also said that the giveaway that this lockdown has silent partners who had nothing to do with the CCP bureaucracy was the constant harping in the Western media on the suffering of animals in Shanghai. So this was a video, I don't know if you saw it post up, but it was a video of like a bunch of cats and dogs being like rounded up and put into like trash bins, and they were injured and all of that. A bunch of people were sending that video out. A bunch of, even some of my friends were like, what the hell is going on? This is absolutely wrong. So it was images of live cats rounded up and put in bags for disposal that were pasted all over the internet. And the Western media has just been entirely focused on that. And he says, although the video certainly was disturbing, I dare horrified Americans to watch a video of factory-scale slaughterhouses in the United States for even a few minutes. He continues to talk about the cruelty to animals, how it is a standard operation to demonize Russia in the Ukraine. For example, a call by Soy Dog co-founder John Daly for help to rescue the dogs and cats of Ukraine has been broadly circulated in the US. There are numerous indications that the Shanghai lockdown is being marketed for Western audiences as the equivalent of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The narrative presented is of a cruel totalitarian communist government in China that oppresses the poor citizens of Shanghai who yearn to be free from these unreasonable, quote, zero COVID restrictions, but no suggestion is offered that COVID restrictions themselves are wrong to begin with. The mainstream media reported that there are videos of locked up residents chanting, "We want food and we want freedom" in a video, and that they were out in their balconies, but the videos just seem too perfect, he says. So I don't know, Pasta, if you want to comment on anything said so far. I can't hear you. You're muted?
I'm sorry. I said there's a few things I want to jump into right away and talk about really quick, because this is interesting, because we're getting into some really, I would say, somewhat new territory as far as how we can put on our critical thinking hat and how we can legitimately criticize China, whatnot, to have do two things at one time. I mean, the whole tactics of, once again, saying, oh, the dog was just fake, or we've seen the drones before. I guess you can downplay those and say that was fake, whatnot, too, as well. Mm-hmm. And this whole kind of mentality that, like, okay, yeah, look, China's doing this, but look how bad, the United States is when it comes to this, when it comes to that and stuff. And it's really kind of wandering into that whataboutism kind of territory. Like, yeah, we get it. We speak out against the United States imperialist government every friggin' day. We understand how bad they are. Does that make it okay for China to start doing stuff that might not be on the high level of, human rights abuses and stuff and whatnot? But, I'm saying, they still are doing something. They're still possibly overreaching, and whatnot, in this crazy authoritarian way. I mean, at what point can we legitimately criticize China because we're right in between there, right? Like, we don't think China's good or bad. We got our eye on China. You know what I'm saying? We're definitely looking at them, and we know, I get it. There's a bunch of people out there that try to blame China for everything. Steve told me he went on a Union of the Wanted a couple weeks ago, and they were trying to direct everything for China for everything. You put on Steve Bannon for a second, it's China everything. You know what I'm saying? It's China this, China that. They're pulling the strings. I get it. But there's some of us over here in critical thinking land that say, well, at what point can you legitimately criticize and say that, hey, man, maybe China's overreaching over here? Because at the end of the day, fam, it's Omicron. It's freaking Omicron, right? It's not like my 81-year-old mother, had a day and a half of serious symptoms. She didn't have to go to the hospital or anything. It's Omicron, and I don't want to hear this whole talk about, okay, and I've mentioned this before, they're legitimately treating people. They're giving them chloroquine. We're on Rokfin only or no?
Yeah, we're still on YouTube. I didn't say we're on Rokfin.
Can we boot over to Rokfin, or do you want to finish up?
Let me see how much, because none of this is really, you know what? Let me finish up my part of the section and then we can go on.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
But anyways, just to tie up my whole statement there, fam, and I'm wondering what you have to say about this, and I know Steve's got a lot to say about this too as well, is at what point can you legitimately criticize China for overreaching? And we understand that there's a whole bunch of people out there that at the end of the day, there was an earthquake in the middle of the Pacific, China. A volcano erupted, in freaking Siberia, China. They blame China for everything, and it's ridiculous, and I get it. But there has to be an in-between ground over there.
Yeah, I'm not saying there isn't. I think there is, but I'm saying it's not just a matter of what this article is saying, and what I believe to be true is that this isn't the entire, this isn't like the Chinese Communist Party, that there is an infiltration happening, that within this nation state of China, there are people that are the ones that are pushing, and that is coming primarily from the West via technology, and that they made the Chinese welcome technology naively, thinking that this technology they could use to advance in the world, and are like, coincidentally, this technology, or non-coincidentally, obviously, this technology is being used to push what the Western agenda more than anything, and to blame the ideology of communism for this thing. Not saying that there's no blame at all, but I'm saying that it's not as like, oh, China, the Communist Party is doing this, therefore communism is bad. That is too easy of an equation, and that's perfect for the right narrative, the right-wing narrative that they've been trying to push, that we're going to become communism, we're going to become China. This isn't about the technology that is being used in China with those robot dogs and stuff is coming from the West. That's not coming from the Communist Party. They never had any access to that technology. They've never had a history of lockdowns. We've had a history of lockdowns. We've had a history of all of this. That is the perspective that I'm trying to introduce here. It's not as clear cut as like, ooh, like, they're just authoritarian. Where did that authoritarianism come from? We continue. So he says the Shanghai lockdown must be seen first in proper geopolitical perspective. China has been subject to high-level pressure from DC over the last 2 months in an effort to thwart any possible cooperation with the Russian Federation since Russian troops entered Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden warned the People's Republic of China on March 18th in a conversation with Xi Jinping that there would be serious consequences for China if it offered any support for Russia, economic or specifically military. And Jen Psaki said that he made clear what the implication and consequences would be if China provides material support to Russia as it conducts brutal attacks against Ukraine cities and its civilians. And just 3 days later, on March 21st, China Eastern Airlines flight, this is something I completely missed. China Eastern Airlines flight 5735 was heading for a smooth landing at the Guangzhou International Airport when it suddenly plunged inexplicably into a nosedive. The cause of the crash has yet to be explained, even 3 weeks later. Many Chinese believe the arguments made in videos posted on Weibo and elsewhere soon after the incident that the crash was the result of a remote hijacking, similar to the 9/11 crashes probably conducted by the United States. The story was confirmed by the American intelligence investigative blog State of the Nation. Moreover, the egregious decision to include a 7-member team from the United States in the formal investigation of this domestic crash suggests something a bit unusual. So there was this crash. They still don't know how it happened. They included a U.S. 7-member team in this investigation. It's just really weird that the U.S. would get involved. And then on March 28th, the Shanghai Municipal People's Government, not the central government in Beijing, launched a radical COVID-19 zero tolerance policy. So the call didn't come from Beijing. And if you know China, everything politically comes from Beijing. If intelligence operatives for the US were looking to give China its own Ukraine and to find a new field for the troublemaking that they funded in Hong Kong previously, Shanghai was a logical choice. Shanghai is riddled with global financial interests, with the head offices, or certainly the major branch for all major multinational investment banks and multinational corporations located there. Their impact on the Chinese economy remains immense. Shanghai has a history of over 100 years as a center for global capital with a parasitic relationship to the rest of the nation. It was Shanghai, after all, that offered extraterritorially to citizens from imperial powers until the 1940s. So Shanghai has a history of working with the West that does not exist elsewhere. So Shanghai also has the most extreme special economic zone policies of any city in China, policies that allow foreign corporations to engage in a broad range of activities without the authorization of the government. As part of its drive to meet the demands of multinational corporations, the Shanghai government has privatized services and promoted technological solutions to just about everything. Shanghai has been so enthusiastic in adopting smart grids, 5G, online governance, and automation that it won the top-ranked globally as smart city from Juniper Research this year. Shanghai has rolled out the red carpet for global finance, giving special privileges to select institutional investors. So they've just been allowing and permitting investment banks to create their own, quote, wealth management joint ventures. So they've been really like open to Western influence. This is completely different than the rest of China. And they talk about billionaire Ma Yan, or Jack Ma, if you guys remember him, who took a lot of funding from Goldman Sachs. He was also involved in the Hong Kong protest. And he created this American investment sort of global marketing and distribution giant called Alibaba that was very similar to Amazon. And he's been very much anti-China. He's been used by the West to promote like all this anti-China rhetoric. And he's popular among globalists. And of course, he is a member of the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. So do these ties to China and the WEF exist? Absolutely. Are people within the communist government working with the World Economic Forum? Absolutely. But it doesn't seem like it's a one, it's everybody. So he talks about how Ma established the Ant Group, which is also an institution that wants to create an unregulated banking system. And then he also talks about the American billionaires that have interest in China, like Steven Schwarzman, the CEO of a private equity firm, Blackstone. And he says that Steven Schwarzman bought off many of the government officials in the Chinese Communist Party with his money, especially the more than $100 million US he gave to establish, among other things, the prestigious Schwarzman Scholars Program at Tsinghua University. Another American billionaire in China is John Thornton, founder of John L. Thornton China Center at Brookings Institute, and is a member of the International Advisory Council of the China Investment Corporation. And he's increasingly pushing for foreign influence in China's financial sector. So those are the money ties that are there. Are there money ties? Yes, to the communist members being bought up. But so the corporate media, of course, is using this to blame China, right? They're saying, oh, what's happening in Shanghai is affecting economics. And I mean, it is. And they're blaming the delays in production, the delivery of electronics, automobiles, and other household goods that are produced and shipped through or dependent on parts of Shanghai. Although the disruption is true, he says, there is every reason to believe that this situation will be exploited and exaggerated to justify efforts by the super rich to destroy the global economy further and to impoverish the Earth's citizens. Combining a Ukraine crisis that justifies the sudden scarcity of agricultural goods, raw materials, natural gas, and manufactured goods with a Shanghai crisis that shuts down global trade offers globalists an opportunity to explain just about any disruption. I mean, this is just so clear to me. It just, you have Ukraine, you have that failure, that ongoing failure that you have geopolitically happening. Then you have China. Now they're going to try Taiwan again. They have Shanghai. They have this sort of, we don't want to be like the communist Chinese, and we already have them vilified, just like we have Russia vilified. The two nations are honestly working together in terms of economics. This seems to me like another attempt to expand global surveillance. And I'm going to finish up and I'll hand it right off to you and we can go on Rokfin only. He notes some solutions to this, what needs to be done. He talks about how the Chinese have been subject to their part in the Great Reset, serving as guinea pigs for social credit systems that allow for constant surveillance and for the evaluation of citizens via AI and for the required use of digital payment systems. The globalists most likely targeted China for these experiments before broader application in the world because the emphasis on technological development in Chinese society and Chinese naivety about the negative impact of technological innovation on human society made Chinese ready victims. So the Chinese wanted to embrace technology to continue their advancement. So they didn't really pay attention as to who was giving, like how this was going to affect them surveillance state-wise. So yes, China is definitely a part of the Great Reset. But these techno-fascist policies are promoted by many bureaucrats in the Chinese Communist Party, but they did not originate in China. They are but a part of a global strategy for control of the world's economy by the financial elites, cunning men who flatter the Chinese about the effectiveness of their response to COVID-19 and their potential to be innovative leaders through AI. And finally, what is desperately needed in response, he says, to the current effort of globalists to induce needless conflicts between nation states and within nation states through operations like the Shanghai lockdown is an alliance of citizens in China, Russia, the United States, and other countries against the predations of multinational investment banks and corporations, an alliance that resembles the international anti-fascist movements of the 1930s. The Shanghai lockdown was designed to increase the isolation of the individuals in a technological prison, while also creating greater distance between Americans or Westerners and Chinese who ought to be cooperating to respond to the threat of techno-fascism. He says it's time for us all to come together in response. So this perspective to me was extremely kind of like where I think this is at. I don't think, and we've talked about this a little bit, you know, like, is Russia pushing back? I think elements of Russia are pushing back. I think elements of China are going to be pushing back. The global agenda is very obvious. They want to exert global technological fascism over all of us. But I do think that it's not as simple as saying that it's just nation states. It's I think that there are breaks in these nation states, and there are people that have sold themselves out to these global fascists. And so that's where I think the Shanghai thing comes in, and that perspective. But yeah,
it's a very intriguing and interesting article.
Yeah,
Emmanuel Pastrike, right? I mean, guy went to Harvard, went to Yale, was at the University of Tokyo for a while. So, I mean, it's very intriguing. Definitely.
Yeah, the thing is, we don't know yet. We don't know. We can only infer. We can only look at like some of the things he posted about how China doesn't have a history of doing that. How Shanghai is a perfect city to manipulate. You can look at, are these things happening? Yeah, likely these things are happening. It's just weird how like elements of the Chinese Communist Party are not talking about this, or how elements are like the direction to lockdown didn't come from Beijing, that it came from Shanghai. So it's just really interesting to me in terms of the geopolitical aspect of what's happening everywhere else.
Well, too, also kind of explaining the culture, saying that, like they were the ready victims because of their history, right? And why the globalists would choose them to try out their social credit score and whatnot. So, I mean, there's a lot of talk about that going on. Me and Steve were talking this morning about conquered people, how their culture is, and